Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We begin this time, as we so often do, by looking at an item. Evelyn, a unique gun used by the Knights of Cainhurst. It does not differ from the guns of the workshop in that it uses mercury bullets, but those of Cainhurst have a tendency to place a heavier emphasis on blood quality. This gun, crowned with a woman's name, is an elaborate masterpiece even in its design, and is said to have been often loved by knights. So, this is a pretty straightforward translation, and it actually touches on a few points we've looked at before. I could, for instance, talk about how my pronunciation, and likely the English spelling, is influenced by the phonetic representation in the Japanese, Evelyn, or point out the variations on the simple term gun used throughout this description. For that matter, we're also seeing some shifts in terminology that I've talked about in the past, like the use of quicksilver instead of mercury for the bullets, or blood tinge instead of blood quality, and that latter point hasn't really come up again since back in episode 12. However, since we've addressed all those points before, I'd like to look instead at the treatment of the final set of lines. Here, I think we're seeing a great example of how looking at all the information together is producing a better translation than a more literal approach. You may have noticed that in my more literal translation, I said this gun was crowned with a woman's name, because the character for a crown is actually being used in the Japanese. In fact, the other definition for kansuru in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary actually involves putting a crown on someone's head. But obviously this gun isn't having a literal coronation. Instead, it's being given a specific name or title, with the connotation that this is significant. So, how to represent this naturally in English? Well, reading ahead, we can see that knights are said to literally love these guns, so why not say they were lovingly named after a woman? This also fits in well with what we know of Cainhurst knights, with the themes of grand naming conventions, a powerful queen, a focus on artfulness, and an emphasis on blood. Speaking of which...
Visitor. Moon-scented hunter. I am Annalise, Queen of Castle Cainhurst. Ruler of the Vilebloods, and sworn enemy of the Church. Yet our people are murdered, and we are prisoner to this wretched mask. What is it thou art in search of?
Oh, nothing really. I was just curious what you would say if I decided to kneel before you. Although...
Speak thy mind.
On second thought, how about I swear that oath?
Well, well. An odd hunter thou art indeed. We've tired of these piteous nights. Share in our plight, and take oath against the Church. If thou wouldst this path walk, I prithee, partake of my rotted blood.
I don't know, that sounds kinda creepy.
A wise choice. There is no more to be said. Away from mine gaze.
And now I'm gonna break in over some repeated dialogue because I wanted to emphasize how well I think this antiquated language works, particularly towards the end of this set of dialogue. Annalise cautions us of the repercussions of becoming a Vileblood, then uses the term ayate in a phrase meant to indicate that if you still have the wish to become one after hearing the consequences, it must be a bold and deliberate choice. Then she uses a mild command form should you wish to take that step. Some of this might get lost in a fully modern translation, but here I think the archaic phrasing shines.
If thou wouldst this path walk, I prithee, partake of my rotted blood.
Anyway, let's say yes.
Very well. Drink deep of our blood. Feel the spreading corruption burn. Now, thou art too a Vileblood. We two, the very last on this earth.
Well, start out kneeling to a queen and end up drinking her blood. This has been weird. I'd better go.
We await thy return, for the honor of Cainhurst.
Okay, that was quite a lot of dialogue, but I'd actually like to start my analysis with what appears as a single term in the original Japanese. You may have noticed that where the official English has Annalise deliver the line, "We are prisoner to this wretched mask," my more literal version apparently goes for broke in saying, "and me a prisoner of the solitary prison iron mask." That's because, in the original Japanese, the kanji for solitary, prison, iron, and mask are presented as a single term. This implies to me that apparently in the world of Bloodborne there exists what might be considered either a torture implement or a method of imprisonment that's something like a solitary confinement mask, and Queen Annalise is being held prisoner in one of them. This, of course, fits with all the other evidence we've seen of what happened at Cainhurst, from general evidence of slaughter to the story of the attack on the Vilebloods by the executioners, and with Logarius serving as some sort of restraint on their undying queen. Personally, I've also wondered about connections to real-world masks that have been associated with confinement, like the Man in the Iron Mask, or the anti-bite mask famously featured in Silence of the Lambs. Actually, in researching a bit about unused content for Cainhurst, that anti-bite mask idea seems like it could be even more applicable, since there's a literal connection to vampires in a lot of Cainhurst gear that is only hinted at thematically in the game as it exists now. But in terms of the localization choice, I thought this was an interesting case where the fact that this translation is being presented in a video game is doubly relevant. First of all, it's important to recognize that there's something to be careful of here. This could be one of those game-specific terms that requires its own official name. That's kind of how the Japanese treats it, since apparently a solitary prison iron mask can be referred to in the world of Bloodborne like we might speak of something like manacles. However, this specific dialogue turns out to be the only time in the game that term is used. This means it doesn't necessarily have to be translated as a game-specific term, and so the other aspect of this being presented in a video game becomes relevant. That is, the player can actually see this mask just by looking at Annalise. This provides some measure of freedom in that the mask doesn't need to be described in great detail, as it might if this line were being delivered in a novel. Given that, and looking at some of the immediate context of the line, I think it becomes clear fairly quickly that a literal translation isn't going to sound very natural here. "We are prisoner to this solitary prison iron mask" is obviously out of place, but even reworking the term a bit could still come across as awkward. "We are prisoner to this iron solitary confinement mask" doesn't sound much better. And if you simply cut the term down to something like iron mask, well, then you're leaving out information anyway. Shifting instead to how Annalise feels about the mask is something I consider an inspired choice. Because what's the point of having Annalise say she's a prisoner to the solitary prison iron mask anyway? It's to emphasize her plight. Solitary, prison, iron, these are all terms meant to connote some measure of harshness and despair. So why not go straight for that and have Annalise speak of this wretched mask, especially when the player can then walk right up and get a closer look if they want to. Not only is this leveraging the medium this translation is being done for, then, I would argue it's also rooted in the character of Annalise and the spirit of the original term. Which brings me to the other line I wanted to look at here, spoken as you drink Annalise's blood. In my more literal version, it's a very simple line. It is Vileblood, so no doubt you will find it hot. While the official version is considerably more evocative. Feel the spreading corruption burn. And this is another case where I think there's a lot being accomplished through this rewording. For one thing, it still conveys the most basic meaning of the Japanese. It lets you know that the blood you are imbibing is impure and that drinking it is associated with heat. But beyond that, it also gets at the unsettling nature of what's happening here. We already know that blood can transform people. We've seen the werewolves of Old Yarnum, and know that the beasts who roam its streets were transformed by the blood of the healing church. Now we're in a similar situation with a different kind of transformative blood that seems designed to reference a common trope of vampire lore, the idea that drinking vampiric blood turns you into one. That is almost literally what happens to our character in this scene. We drink of accursed blood, a kind hated by the church, and when we are done, the ruler who gave us that blood tells us that we are now kin. Using the phrase, "feel the spreading corruption burn," thus not only highlights the heat and the corrupt nature of the blood, but I would argue it also emphasizes the transformation, which in this case seems highly relevant. Plus, it works nicely with the official name for the rune we get as a result, corruption, but I'll talk more about that when we look at the rune itself. For now, though, let's switch gears and look at this note. Just ahead, you may witness holy mystery. Well, that sounds like it could be interesting. Why don't we go check it out? I'm starting to think maybe this wasn't the best idea. All I see up ahead is this sudden drop. And there's this weird scuffling noise from behind me, like someone was gonna kick me off. Anyway, while our character is getting plunged down into a poisonous swamp, I'd like to focus in on two specific features of the Japanese that come up both in the note we just read and in this next bit of gloating.
Don't dally, you lucky scamp! The gift of the Godhead cometh!
First, you may have noticed that while translating the note used to lure us out to the ledge, both my more literal version and the official one speak of witnessing something, while when the character who kicked us down taunts us, he speaks as if the thing we wanted was going to come to us. It's something that may seem odd, but this actually goes back to an interesting ambiguity in the Japanese that's left me puzzled at least once before. It involves the usage of an incredibly common kanji, the one most frequently used to represent the word mieru, which is the potential form of the verb to see, or in other words, to be able to see. This is where the fairly straightforward translation of witness comes from in the note, this way to witness a miracle. However, it turns out that the kanji used to represent this word can also be read in a different way that gives it an entirely distinct nuance. That is, it can be used as a polite verb for a meeting with a superior, something along the lines of have audience with. Taken in that light, the line, the gift of the Godhead cometh, makes a bit more sense. This could even be read as a deliberate trick in the Japanese, where that spidery character writes a note that reads to a player like there's something extraordinary to be seen just ahead, when in fact it's meant to indicate that stepping forward will provide an audience with a higher being. By this reading, the confusion is then resolved when the trickster reveals that the holy mystery approaches. Given how this event plays out in the game, I'm not sure that interpretation is correct, but it is a possibility I thought worth mentioning. Also, I wanted to be sure to say that I probably would have completely missed this myself if it weren't for YouTube user Last Protagonist, who pointed this out in a comment on episode 27 of Translationborne, so many thanks to him for the astute observation. But let me return now to the second aspect of the Japanese that's repeated both in the note and that quick bit of dialogue. Here I have in mind the term shimpi, and it's one that we've talked about before and one that we're sure to look at again. It appears in a number of different contexts in the game, and as Last Protagonist has also pointed out to me, there's a larger debate to be had concerning its use in the game as a whole. But for now I want to focus on the immediate context concerning our interactions with that spidery trickster, to get a sense for how each language sets up this storyline. Let's go through them in order, using my go-to rough translation of the Japanese. The first time we interact with him, we're told that in the hidden old church to the right of the Grand Cathedral is holy mystery, sure to be a source of strength on the hunt. Then, when we speak to him behind the door of the Nightmare Lecture Hall, we're told that having audience with holy mystery brings people happiness. Then we find the note about being able to witness or have audience with holy mystery just ahead. And finally, that same character tells us that the holy mystery we've longed for is sure to approach. The one other context I think it's important to keep in mind here is that holy mystery, or shimpi, is also the name of one of our stats, arcane in English, and this arguably lends a bit more credence to the idea that pursuing this holy mystery will grant us strength on the hunt. So basically, the Japanese uses this single term as a way of playing on the desire of a player to get stronger. It's a vague word to be sure, but its continued use is meant to lure players out to that ledge to get kicked off. Now let's look at the official English. Here, we're first tempted with the phrase, the gift of the Godhead will grant you strength. Then we're greeted in the lecture hall with, what joy it is to behold the divine. The note we read on the ledge speaks of witnessing a miracle, and then finally we're taunted with, the gift of the Godhead cometh. Clearly there's a through line to the English as well, speaking of gods and miracles. It's also worth pointing out that the official English includes references outside the equivalent lines of the Japanese, such as the one about treading a measure with the gods. And of course, there's the fact that the first and last lines in this scenario use the same phrase, the gift of the Godhead. So overall, I think in terms of providing consistent but vague reasoning to lure players out to that ledge, the various versions of shimpi in the official English accomplish what they need to here, even if the guidance is perhaps not quite as strong as the Japanese. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to leave any feedback you might have, and thanks for watching, everyone.